A bit about where have we come from this year so far, where we are right now, and where we're hopefully headed for a better back end, but some things that we need to think about from an animal health perspective. So it's been a challenging year on people, and it's been a challenging year on animals likewise. But animals have coped fairly well. There is about to come, or it's probably here right now, is an increased parasite risk, osteotagia, but more importantly lungworm, and we'll talk to that. And the importance of dry matter intakes and water, especially with how we're feeding our cows differently now with a lot more dry materials, and feeding the rumen and the importance of long fibre. So milk constituents this year are slightly down, unfortunately. So milk proteins in particular, milk lactose as well, slightly down, and we would have been on a rising plane of milk protein growth year on year, and that's because genetics is changing, grassland management, cow management has been improving year on year, and we're getting more protein, more solids in general out of the cows. The fats have been higher, but that's more of a reflection of the type of feed that cows have been getting with more fibre in there. But the protein's been down is a significant one. Somatic cell counts are slightly up, and it's only slightly, but that's a reflection on the difficult spring there was. There was a lot more bacterial challenge on the cows in the springtime. Cows were in, they were out, they were getting fed indoors, they were on cubicles, they were in dirty roadways, and the fields were wet, and the gaps into the fields were very challenging. So there was more infection pressure for bacteria into the udder, and cows got more infections. The other side of it was that the immune system of those cows, because of the stress of the weather and all the rest of it, they weren't as able to fight off that infection. So cows are getting challenged by bacteria every day, and most days they fight them off. The cow wins and the bacteria loses. But when their immune system was challenged and the cows were slightly stressed and things were far from ideal in weather conditions, you had a more difficult fight for the cow. And more infections probably got in on cows, and the cell count is slightly up. So that's the explanation for that one. Cow condition, though, is good overall. Cows have been well fed, and what they got was very high quality. So they've held condition very well. And in general, animal health has been good. You know, there's been no major health disasters for animals. So they've, you know, because they've been well fed, they've held a reasonable immune status, fought off the diseases that they would get challenged, and the early indications for fertility would be pretty good. So we've been talking to UCD, we've been talking to Teagasc, and people who have scanned early, it looks pretty good. It looks on a par with last year, which was fine. So they have coped, is the summary. There is an increased parasite risk right now. We've had not a good year for parasites up until now. We had a cold, wet spring, which wasn't good for parasitic development, and then we had a very hot, dry period in June, July. And that's not good for parasitic development either. But what has happened is all the parasites have accumulated on the land, and they haven't gone through their full development, and they haven't dispersed onto grass because of the dry weather. What you've now got is the rain that has fallen, or has fallen, is allowing the moisture level, and the way the rain has fallen itself has allowed the parasites to disperse. So just to go through lungworm as the main parasite of concern for the next few weeks, and it's actually there right now. If we start that life cycle here where the cow is picking up the lungworm larvae from the grass, okay? So the cow ingests the L3, the third stage larvae, and they go into the stomach. But from the stomach, they have to get into the lungs to go through their full life cycle, to mature and to lay eggs, and for those larvae to develop in the lungs. So they migrate from the stomach into the lungs, and they do that. They go through the viscera into the thorax and make their way into the lungs. And the L3 larvae, when they're in the lungs, become the adult. So that's the next stage. They become the adults. They lay their eggs. The eggs develop into L1 larvae, the first stage larvae, and then they're coughed up into the back of the throat, and then back down into the stomach, out in the dung, onto the ground, in the dung pat. So the L1 larvae are in the dung pat, and then they develop to L3 larvae over a period of time in that dung pat. But to get back into another cow, all the parasite wants to do is multiply and replicate and survive. So to get into another animal, they have to get out of that dung pat onto the grass again. So they've developed two ways of doing that. One is direct rainfall with a splash. The larvae make their way onto the surface of the dung pat, and the splash of the water spreads them out. But there's also a pilobolus fungus that grows on the dung pat, and that is it's microscopically big. You can't see it, and it's mushroom shaped. And what it does to spread its own spores is to grow up. The spores are inside it, and it bursts, explodes, and shoots the spores into the air, and they spread out about 2 meters. But the L3 larvae of the lungworm have realized that they need to climb up onto that fungus, and whenever it explodes and spreads the spores, it also spreads the larvae. So they spread out to 1 to 2 meters around the cow pat. So that's where we are right now. We've got a lot of dung pats on the land that have the lungworm in them, and the cows already are picking up that. And from the previous meetings we've had this week, there are a good number of people who have seen the effects of lungworm already since the rain has come a little while ago. So just to go back to the lungworm slide, that's going to lead to a risk of lungworm in the next couple of weeks, and probably is there now. It's maybe something that you should be thinking about treating right now. The clinical signs, typically we see cough and increased respiratory rate from the pneumonia that they get having the lungworm in their lungs. Something that isn't necessarily associated or hasn't been associated in farmers' minds about lungworm is a significant milk drop. Well, I would have talked to farmers over the past number of years that would have had 50% milk drop. Now, sometimes that would be quite early on in the year. Last year, I remember getting a lot of phone calls in a 2-week period with 25, 30, 40, 50% milk drops and not being able to understand. Then, a week later, the cough developed. It was the lungworm. So the milk drop is something that you may or may not see in the early stages of the lungworm infection. In terms of diagnosing lungworm, it's very difficult in the early stages. So if we go back to the slide, they've got their larval infection and it's gone into the stomach. It's made its way to the lungs, and it's now causing a big inflammatory reaction in the lungs. But there isn't the L1 larvae coming out in the dung yet, because they haven't gone through their full life cycle. So if you test the dung, it's negative for lungworm larvae, and you think they don't have it. They do have it, it's just they haven't got that far yet. And the same goes for the bulk milk test. The bulk milk test requires the cow to convert and create antibodies, which is great for all the other diseases that we test for, but for the lungworm, it just doesn't work. It's not going to tell you till about 2 months after that the cow had lungworm 2 months ago, which is not any good to you today. So diagnosis is difficult. The only way you can identify that you have lungworm is to listen, to observe the cows. As soon as you've got 2 or 3 cows coughing this week or next week, time to get on and treat. Okay. Now, some farms don't have lungworm at all, like some farms don't have fluke. If you don't have lungworm in your farm, this may not come at all. But if you had to treat the animals over the last couple of years for lungworm, for coughing through the summer, it's going to be happening in the next week or two. Okay. Animals will get worse once you've treated. Okay. So what they've got right now is they've got live worms going through their cycle in the lungs. The minute you kill those worms, they have to be cleared out. And the only way they're coming out is by coughing them up. So treating is the right thing to do, but the cows are going to appear to get worse before they get better. It's still it's the right thing to have done, but expect that the cows are going to cough for the next 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. And then it'll settle, but there is an issue where it can come back. Just give me 1 minute. Reinfection is an issue. So the products that you'd like to be using are products with persistency. Okay, so for the likes of the cows, zero milk withdrawal, epinephrine is going to get you to 4 to 6 weeks. Okay, but 4 weeks later, say mid-September, if the cough is back, you may have to treat again. It depends on how much of a challenge the cows are getting. Okay, all cattle are at risk. So, you know, if you've got it in the cows and the young stock are a couple of fields away, there's going to be the same risk there as well. So it's best to get on and treat them all. So then just a quick bit on water intake and fibre. Look, water, the main urgency for water has probably passed at this stage. When we had the very hot and dry weather, cows were sweating a lot. They were getting very little water intake from the grass because it was so dry. There was very little grass there a lot of times as well. Typically, cows, on 16 kilos of dry matter in the summer of grass, of normal moisture grass, they'd be getting maybe 75 litres of water a day. And so water is not something we nearly need to think about in dairy herds, because they get so much from the grass that they're taking, they just top it up with a small amount. But this year, a lot less grass about and it was a lot drier. They may be only getting a quarter or less of that water from the grass. And then what we were replacing the grass with was a very dry feed. So water was very, very important back then, but it's still important today, because we're still asking cows to give 20 odd litres of milk, and they need 4 to 6 times that volume in water. The dry feeds that are going into them now, high dry matter diet, and the sodium content, particularly the concentrates, is creating a thirst. So we need to make sure that the cows have access to water. So there's plenty of volume, and flow rates are critical for that, but maybe more access points in the roadways or in the collecting yards, because, as I say, cows are getting much drier feeds than they would normally do. Just the last one then is the importance of long fibre. What we have this year is a shortage of fodder. It's the roughage, it's the fibre that we can't replace. We can bring some in, but it's about really making sure that you budget that to do us until we get significant volumes of grass next spring. So it's about identifying what you have. We don't really feed the cow. We feed the rumen, and the rumen feeds the cow. But for a healthy rumen, we need that fibre. The cow needs, the rumen needs the fibre for the cutting. So there's a significant shortage of fibrous feeds. That's what needs to be budgeted, and we need to make a plan. Healthy cows need a healthy rumen, and a healthy rumen needs lots of fibre. So measure, manage, and make a plan. Just to mention it, just in the summary, milk ureas have gone up in the past week or two, or probably just in the last week really. From the results from the lab, 30s, even into the 40s and a few at 50s. Fairly high and a fair big jump from what you would have been used to over the last couple of months. It's the nitrogen that's coming through in the grass from the fertiliser that had been spread a month, 2 months ago. A lot of that fertiliser is still in the ground. The grass is taking it up. It's not going to be so much the fertiliser you spread last week. It's more the older fertiliser that's in the soil. It's been taken up by the grass. There's a lot more nitrogen going into cows that way. The nitrogen has to be excreted, and it's done by urea. And so the blood urea level is coming up. The milk is being made from the blood. And so the milk urea level comes up. It's nothing to be worried about. It's going to come up and it's going to go down again, and it's fine. You wouldn't want prolonged high milk ureas, especially through the breeding season or in the post-calving period, because it's an indication that they're getting too much protein, and that breaking down protein costs energy, which then could drop your energy balance, which could have an effect on body condition and fertility. Cows are hopefully at this stage in calf. The high milk urea that's going to come and go over the next couple of weeks, nothing to worry about. So cows have coped well in summary. They're in good health, they're in good body condition. The important thing is that we see the rest of the year through, that we get some milk, we get some cash flow from that milk, and don't let the parasites get in the way of that. So manage that increased parasite risk. Right now, if you're not happy with the cow's health, there's a bit of cough there, get in, get them treated. With the high dry matter feeds, ensure they have access to water, and the long fibre is really what it's all about. Don't let this year's problems run into next year. February, March next year, cows are going to need fibre. We don't know what the weather will be like then. They're going to need a good fibrous base to feed from in the early lactation, so we can't afford to get it wrong. So fodder budgeting, identify what you have, identify what your deficit is. Martin's going to cover it in detail, but make sure that you have enough fibre to feed the cow for that healthy rumen next year.